The European, of course, recognized this immediately. That is why when we talk about our slave history, we often talk about the destruction of African culture. We talk about the rewriting of black history as an attempt, again, of destroying the African culture and an African personality. We recognize that the destruction of that personality, the separating of us from our culture, the separating of us from our history, is a separation of us ultimately from our identity. It means a split and a schism is created in the personality. When a schism and a split is created in the personality, the individual is made exceedingly uncomfortable. It is the first rule of brainwashing. When you wish to brainwash a person, when you wish to transform their personality, you break them from their old personality. You break them from their old moorings. You make them question and doubt their previous culture and their previous learning. When you get them to begin to doubt themselves, when you get them to reject their culture, when you get them to see their past lives as negative, when you get them to feel ashamed of that past life, when you get them to feel guilty of that past life, and any good brainwasher knows this, and you check out the Moonies and any other brainwashing organization, you will see this process being put forth. Once you get that, the individual then is left in a tremendous state of confusion, in a tremendous state of ambivalence. That state is painful. It motivates the individual then to seek some kind of relief, to seek some way out.
Hello everyone, welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. I wanted to talk about a subject today because I think it's very important for us African Americans as we're starting to grow in our African identity and as we're starting to acknowledge our Africanness that we don't let anything deter us. And I'm talking to African Americans about how we might feel about people who are from the continent of Africa. Now, let me first say that my African brothers and sisters, and I know a lot of you follow this channel, overall, I don't get this sentiment from them. I don't get a sentiment of resentfulness against African Americans from them. Overall, especially when you actually travel to the continent of Africa, if you're African American and you're going home to Africa, a lot of Africans are welcoming, especially if you're going with respect, meaning I'm coming here because I want to learn about myself. I'm coming here because I want to find a lost history that was stolen from my people. A lot of them, when you come with that respect, with that sincerity, with that reverence, they're going to be welcoming. They want to teach you your culture. They want you to learn your language. So this isn't talking about, I would say this is not most Africans. And I would even say that it's probably a small minority, but there is a certain mentality that I'm starting to notice in the same way that I'll call out the mentality of ADOS, even though that's not representative of the African American community. I do want to call out this mentality because I don't want it to deter any of us who are growing in our African identity, growing in our African culture. So the attitude I'm talking about, it kind of started, I was on Twitter, and someone I follow, I was watching my timeline, and I seen this tweet that was basically saying African American celebrities need to stop going to Africa seeking to have these royal titles. So not that, we just go and get those royal titles, but that the idea that these celebrities, African American celebrities, are actually going to Africa for the purpose of getting a royal title. So when I seen that, I'm like, that's not true. I don't know of one person ever who was actually went over to Africa for that purpose. Now, are there African Americans who have been given these titles, such as Queen Mother or installed? Absolutely. And a lot of those people who go there, they had no idea. For example, Michael J. White, when he went to Ghana and he was installed, he had no idea that he was even going to be installed. That was like a surprise that the local people did for him. Lisa Ray went over to Ghana and she was named an honorary Queen Mother, but that was because she was doing humanitarian work in Ghana. So the idea that these people who went over to Africa, who I believe were trying to reconnect with our roots, because that is where our roots are. The idea that we actually went over there for the purpose of becoming a king or a queen, that was just false. I mean, no one's ever said that. If anyone has, any black celebrity who has, please show me that where they said, oh, I'm going to go over to Africa so that I can become a king or a queen. That's just not a mentality that our people even have, particularly for our people who are conscious. I mean, I've never even thought about that. Now, when I seen that, I'm like, well, that's just not true mentality or a true categorization of our experience when we're going over to Africa. Yeah, a lot of the comments on this post I felt like were very negative. So, for example, some people say, "Oh yeah, well, they think that they're Jesus," and someone say, "Oh, why do they always have to go over to Ghana? Why do they act like they're all from Ghana?" Which, if you don't know, most of us have lineage in Ghana, if you did not know that. Another person said, "Oh, well, they get that mentality because they all believe that they're kings and queens, and that's because of their affinity for European kings and queens," which, again, is just not true. Like, I don't even think that when African Americans say we're kings and queens that we're referencing the European definition. We're thinking about the fact that Africans in the ancient civilizations were not slaves. They were not colonized people. Yes, we know that not all of us are descended from kings and queens. But the fact is, we also know that we've been taught that Africans did not have a civilization. We've been taught that Africans did not have kingdoms. We've been taught that Africans were living in jungles, that they've been living in huts, they don't wear clothes, and all these other things. So when we say we come from kings and queens, we're saying, no, that mentality or that thing that we've been taught from the colonizers, from the enslavers, that all of us were nothing, that we didn't have a civilization. That is not true. Actually, we did have civilizations. We had kingdoms. We had kings and queens. So that's really what we're saying when we say you're a king and a queen. So, I didn't like that post because I felt like it just espoused a lot of negative connotations for people who, again, I truly believe are going over to Africa out of sincerity, out of trying to find ourselves. To my African brothers and sisters from the continent, one thing that you might never get to understand completely is, particularly for African Americans, I'd say more than anyone, because out of everyone in diaspora, we've had our culture wiped out from our subconscious, from our being, more than anyone. Even our Caribbean brothers and sisters, a lot of them still know what parts of Africa they come from. A lot of them still have a lot of the cultural, the dances, the clothes, the food. A lot of it is still reminiscent of Africa. In America, however, it was a agenda of the slave master that we do not see ourselves as African. So they intentionally wiped that from our memory. They intentionally wanted us to not identify ourselves as African because in their fear was that if we know that where we come from, then these people aren't going to accept these harsh conditions that they're put under. It's not to say slavery wasn't harsh other places. Slavery is a harsh institution, period. But the degree of psychological manipulation that happened in America is unprecedented. The degree of dehumanization, the degree of humiliation, castration, it's been unmatched. When you look at if you look comparatively at how slavery is carried out. Again, not to say that the other slaveries were not as bad. All slavery is bad, but the white man in America, who was the majority, wanted to make sure that he kept his slave with a degree of not knowing themselves, which is why for a long time we don't call ourselves African. We didn't call ourselves African American. And the title African American is a recent title. I look at us as African more than anything, but at one time we only called ourselves colored. At one time we only called ourselves Negro. Think about that. They would not call us African. They called us Negro. They called us colored, and of course they called us nigger. So when we're talking about the fact that we really weren't allowed to identify ourselves with the continent of Africa, that is something that was put on us, and it's a pain that I think that no one will really understand or get, because most of us have no clue where we come from. Now, every once in a while, you'll find some people who are lucky enough that their ancestors who were enslaved, they weren't so removed from Africa. So, for example, I think the last slave brought over to the U.S. was closer to the 19th century. But again, those were the more recent people who came here. Most of us don't really know any of our culture. So after seeing that post on Twitter, and this is what really got me to like, all right, I need to do a video on this because I don't want this to be something that deters our people from identifying with Africa, and even deters us from identifying with the African brothers and sisters, because understand there's going to be ignorance on both sides. You're going to find a lot of people in America who are ADOS who are who identify as ADOS, and not everyone espouses this sentiment who identifies as ADOS, but you're going to find some who want nothing to do with Africa. And you're going to find some who want a lot to do with Africa, but they just want to make sure that the struggles are separated. You're going to find so many different variations of people among African Americans and among people on that continent of Africa. So it's just important that we recognize this is not the overall mentality, but this does exist and it does need to be addressed. So, after seeing this tweet, I just happened to be on YouTube. And I seen a clip of the new show called Mixed Dish. So Mixed Dish, is a spinoff of Blackish. And there was a scene where there was the mother who was, more Afrocentric, and a sister who's African American. So they're both trying to teach their daughter what their culture is. And so the sister who's they're both African American, but the sister who's more of African American culture, she brings out a typical Thanksgiving dinner for us, like chitlins and greens and all that stuff. And a sister who is more Afrocentric brings out a table of a plate with of African foods. So like kenkey and fufu and jollof and aguse, like a bunch of African foods. And when you read the comments on this video, a lot of African people were offended at this African American woman having all these foods together, because typically inside of African, whenever they're eating those meals, they don't eat all those foods together. Although I will say, people who say that, oh, we never eat those foods together, there are times when that does happen, because I've been to a lot of African weddings, African events. If it's a big event, they will eat like multiple, you'll have multiple, African meals, the same that you would at any wedding. So for example, you might have okra stew with jollof on the side and with goat stew on the side. Like, you might have those things. So it's not like it never happens. But overall, they don't eat all of those like on one plate. And a lot of people felt the need to basically to downplay the African Americans for getting it wrong. And this brought me back to something that I read years ago. But when I first read this, I was not on YouTube all like that, so I didn't really respond to it. But there was this article that I remember that came out, and it was discussing this idea of African Americans culturally appropriating Africans. And when it came out, I was like, shrugged it off, like, this doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? But because I realized this is a mentality for a lot of people, particularly when they see African Americans reconnecting with Africa, there's a lot of people who feel like it could be cultural appropriation, or feel like we shouldn't get to identify ourselves with Africa the way that they do. So let's talk about this article. So the article was called "Black Americans, Please Stop Appropriating African Clothing and Tribal Marks." So I'm going to just read from the article. Can Black people culturally appropriate one another? It's a nuanced question that seems to either set tempers aflare or create vacuums of silence in a room. After going through pictures taken at the latest Afropunk Festival, it's definitely one that I have to ask. And if Blacks can, why is the disgust and uproar surrounding this ongoing phenomenon only reserved for instances of when white people appropriate us? I ask this because Black Twitter is littered with countless examples of the uproar that ensues when white people appropriate Black culture. Words such as fancy dress, mockery, and profiteering are thrown out quite freely, but it seems that but no one seems to realize that this same violation is committed against us Africans, all under the guise of tribal fashion and connecting to the motherland. Yes, I know African-inspired prints are popping right now, and many African designers have chosen to showcase certain styles to the global fashion scene, but it appears to me and my African friends that it's been taken a step further. I understand that for the most part, many of my own Black American friends are well-meaning when they talk about African fashion, but the end result is the same. Ask yourself, how exactly is that any, oh, I'm sorry, let me read this quote. You could take a cultural dress, mark, or trait with all of its religious and historical connotations, dilute it and bring it out for occasions when you want to look trendy. Ask yourself, let me X that out. How exactly is that any better? I'm not trying to start a war, but I just I would just like you to all realize the hypocrisy of seeing someone wearing a Fulani symptom ring, rocking a jalaba painted with Yoruba-like tribal marks all while claiming that this is meant to be respectful. It's a hodgepodge, a juxtaposition, a right mess of regional, ethnic, and cultural customs, and it screams ignorance and cultural insensitivity. Yes, that's right. Even when worn by Black Americans, I know it looks cool and the wearer looks unique, but if you look at what it is, if you look at it for what it is, it's still cultural appropriation. Okay. I think that's the gist of the article. Now I'll post the rest if you want to read the rest. But that's the gist of the article. She's basically saying that African Americans, we culturally appropriate whenever we wear Afrocentric clothing. Because we just do it because it's trendy, not because we actually have reverence for the culture. And one, clearly this writer does not have a knowledge of history, because this is not something that African Americans just started doing. African Americans have been rocking African clothing, African prints, really since the Black Power movement. When there was in the late 60s and 70s, where there was a real movement across America where we said, you know what, we're not going to deny our African identity. We're going to recognize that this is a part of who we are. And that's when we've been started doing that. The fact that this idea that it's trendy, no, it's not trendy for us. Instead, it's actually us reconnecting with our culture. Now, the thing I want to emphasize, number one, for African Americans, understand that no one can tell you whether or not you're African. You're African. No one can tell you that you're not. Even Kwame Nkrumah said it. So as Kwame Nkrumah says, it's not being in Africa that makes you African. It's Africa being in you. So when you understand the Black struggle in America, understand, number one, that our people did not make a choice to come to America. That choice was taken from us. Those people were African. They intended on remaining in Africa, yet they were taken against their will hundreds of thousands of miles away. And those people's descendants now have a claim to that African identity. Now, ours is more nuanced because, of course, we have different African identities. We are so mixed up as African Americans that we don't necessarily have one place where we can point to. There are multiple places. We know mostly that our African culture is in West Africa. However, we can have every claim to identify with West African cultures just based on the fact that that is where we're from. We're not from America. Clearly, whenever you look at how America treats us, you know that America is not accepting of us. We were never meant to be here. We were never meant to be free here. If you look at what happened after the Civil War, for example, there was a lot of movement to try to get all the Blacks back to Africa because they did not want to deal with them, because we were not supposed to be here, period. So the fact that we're here, if we still want to identify with where we come from, we still want to identify with our native languages, with our native cultures, that is totally up to us, and it's up for us to define. So I just say this as an encouragement. If you see attitudes from our brothers and sisters who are from the continent, and like I said, this is not most of them, but there are some who might make you feel uncomfortable with your identification with African culture, understand that it's not up to them to tell you you're African. It's not up to them. It's up to you. Knowing your culture, knowing your history, knowing where your people came from, it's up to you. Now, absolutely, we have to respect our cultures. We have to be sincere in learning about them, and we have to be open and to direction. And frankly, if people from the continent were just saying, African Americans, this is the correct way to do things, or this is how we do things in our culture, that's different than saying, oh, you don't even know what you're talking about. You don't even know what you're wearing. You don't even know the meaning of that outfit. You don't know the meaning of that kente. That's completely different. But if you're doing it in a way that is, hey, you are my brother and my sister, this was taken from you, let me reintroduce you to this part of you. That, to me, is what is a sincere and loving effort to bring us into the global African family. So I just say that to say, for those of us who are in the diaspora, don't allow anyone to make you feel less African. The fact is, you are African because African was in you. It's born in you, and it remains in you because of our connection to our ancestors who were brought here against their will. And if they had it their way, they would have gone back. So that's all I have on this subject. I'm very interested to see what you guys think. And, be respectful in the comments, because again, I did this video to say that should not be a divide. And so not to encourage more division and not to encourage more fighting, but to say that we have to, number one, recognize as African Americans that we do have a right and a claim to the African identity, no matter what some people make you think or feel. But also to my brothers and sisters in Africa, you know, if you see things that we're doing, you feel like we're not correctly representing the culture, bring us into the culture. Let us know. You know, be honest and sincere. Don't be condemning, because if you're condemning us, you're condemning our ancestors who were enslaved and forced not to be able to say our languages, not be able to have our culture, not be able to have our identity. Those are the people that you're condemning. We're not the one that created that sin. We're not the one that created that divide. We're not the one that created the colonial divides. We're the ones who are victims of it, the same as you're a victim of it. So this is just to say, let's stop making one another feel odd or feel out of place. Let's let each other feel like we're brothers and sisters, because ultimately we are, and we're not each other's enemy. Our enemy is the one who's oppressing us. We should be focusing our attention on those enemies. So that's all I have on this video. I will see you guys in the next video. Hi everyone, this is Tierney Cherie. As I've stated in a number of videos, I am part of an organization called We Charge Colonialism, and we are seeking to go to the United Nations for the purpose of petitioning the United Nations for recognition that the United States is guilty of colonizing African Americans. How have they been colonizing us? If you look at every single system in the United States government, whether it's the education system, whether it's the prison system, whether it's the banking and mortgage system, every single system shows that the United States government has put us into a position where they are benefiting off of our suffering. They are benefiting off of our labor. They are benefiting off of our misery. This is the type of relationship that occurs inside of a colony, where the host country is benefiting from the colony. They're abstracting resources. They're abstracting manpower. They're abstracting anything that they can from that people and leaving the people with nothing, leaving the people destitute. Now, the reason why this is important is because we have to recognize that this is what has happened to our people in the United States, the same way as what has happened to our people in the Caribbean, to our people on the continent of Africa, to people all throughout the world. But if we recognize that the African Americans who are enslaved in America were also colonized and are still being colonized, then that means that we have a right to redress. That redress means we have internal self-determination. We have the right to control our institutions. We have the right to control our criminal justice system. The same system that has been oppressing us, when it has been controlled by the outside government, we have a right to control that government ourselves. We have a right to control our police departments. We have a right to control our education systems. We have a right to control our child welfare systems. Now, many of you might be thinking they're not going to let us control our systems. Well, you need to do your history, because if you know about the Native American movements, you know that there was a time where the United States government was not willing to recognize their right to self-governance. However, because they rallied the people, because they organized the people, they were able to actually impose to not just impose, but to put into the Congress the mentality that, you know what, these Native Americans, they do deserve the right to their own selves, because we have not been doing well by them. We have not been doing well by them, and that we've been taking their children, we have been oppressing them, we've been taking their land, we've been inflicting warfare on them. Because of that, we cannot rightfully claim that we have a right to these people, or they have a right to be under our government. The same thing should be of the mentality of African Americans, that we have to understand that every single system in the United States, since its inception, has been made and built to oppress us. If you think that's going to change in the near future, I'm very curious to know why and how, because there's no sign of it changing, and there's no sign of the wealth gap closing. In fact, the wealth gap's only getting worse. That means that we're only going to be more oppressed. We're only going to be more subjugated. We're only going to be more taken advantage of. So for that reason, we have to have control of our institutions, and we have control over our institutions. We make a rightful claim that our people have been the victim of colonization, have been a victim of racism, slavery, have been a victim of something that has amounted and caused our people to be in severe distress today. So it is for that reason why we're going to the United Nations, and we're saying that we have been colonized, and the redress for that colonization is that we need control over our neighborhoods. We need control over the systems that are over-representing us. We need control over those systems, because the dominant system has proven time and time again that it will not do right by Black people. If you are interested in joining this effort, there are a number of committees that you can join. There's a membership support committee. There's There's a PR committee, there's and media relations committee, there's a project management committee. We have so many committees, and the fact is so many of us have talents that are useful for this effort. Even if you think that, you know, maybe you're not necessarily an activist, maybe you don't want to necessarily draft a petition to go to the United Nations, but you just have some type of talent that you think that we could use as we do this effort, please join. Please email us at WeChargeColonialism. If you maybe don't have any time, maybe you're completely booked up, but you just want to actually take a part in the effort and keep tabs on what's going on, become a We Charge Colonialism supporter. That way we can actually communicate with you what actions we're taking and what type of rallying we have to do as a people. But certainly if you have talents and abilities that you feel like could be useful to us, come join, help us out, because this is something that we're trying to do not for ourselves, but for the whole community of Black people in America. That is all we have on this. We will see you soon.